"You don't have to do this here," Marlo whispered, her palm pressed to the bathroom door like it was the only thing keeping the past from rushing in. Avery Lane stood very still in the soft gold light, a small box resting in his hand as if it weighed more than it should. The air smelled faintly of soap and coffee, an impossible mix for a moment that felt like thunder. On the other side of the door, a child's breath caught. A drawing crinkled under nervous fingers. Avery swallowed, his voice low, careful. "I know." Marlo's eyes shone, not with fear the way they once had, but with something that hurt in a new place, like hope trying to fit into a heart that still remembered cages. "Then why—" she began. "Because," he said, and the word broke open in his chest, "this is where I first chose to be kind." A beat of silence. A soft shuffle outside, and then from the hallway, a bright, trembling voice that didn't belong to any memory but the one they were about to make. "Dad?" Avery's gaze flicked to the door. He smiled without looking away from Marlo. "Just a second, Poppy!" he called, gentler than the ocean outside their little town ever sounded. He took one step forward, then another. The box tilted open. A ring caught the light like a tiny sunrise. Marlo's lips parted, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman who had appeared in his house years ago, tired, startled, unsure whether the world would punish her for existing. But this time, she didn't retreat. This time, she breathed in. This time, she stayed, and to understand how a wrong key led them here, how a single mistake became the doorway to the life they didn't dare ask for. "We have to go back. Back to Harbor Pine, back to the morning the lock stuck, back to the sound of a stranger's footsteps in Avery Lane's hallway." Harbor Pine was the kind of coastal town that didn't need skyscrapers to feel tall. The evergreens did the job. They lined the roads like quiet witnesses, their needles dark and patient, their shadows long even when the sun tried its best. Fog rolled in from the water most mornings, softening edges, blurring the line between what was real and what was remembered. Some people loved that about the town. Some people hated it. Avery Lane had learned to live with it. He woke up before his alarm, because his body didn't trust sleep the way it used to. He didn't consider it anxiety, not exactly, more like vigilance, the sort that grew in you when the world had asked you too many times to prove you weren't a threat. He lay still for a few seconds, listening. The house had a sound when it was safe, pipes settling, a distant sigh from the heater, the soft, steady rhythm of a child's breathing down the hall. Avery turned his head and stared at the ceiling, counting the small cracks in the paint like they were stars he could name. Then he moved. Quietly, carefully, because the first rule of being a single parent was this: if your kid is sleeping, you treat the silence like a sacred thing. He got up, rolled his shoulders once, and padded to the kitchen. The floorboards knew him. They creaked in predictable places. His house wasn't big. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small living room with an old couch he'd promised himself he'd replace, and a kitchen that smelled permanently like roasted coffee and lemon cleaner. It was clean because order was a kind of prayer. It was quiet because quiet meant no one was yelling. Avery opened the fridge and took out the carton of eggs, the milk, the strawberries he'd bought yesterday because Poppy had pointed at them like they were treasure. He cracked an egg into a bowl with one hand, a small skill he'd learned after years of cooking while holding a toddler on his hip. He made pancakes because pancakes were a guaranteed smile. He made coffee because coffee was a guaranteed survival. As the batter sizzled on the pan, Avery glanced at the wall calendar. It was full of reminders in neat handwriting: dentist appointment, school art day, Sienna's weekend, parent-teacher meeting, Sienna. The name sat in his mind the way an old scar sat on skin, healed over, yes, but always there when the weather changed. Their divorce had been civilized. That was what everyone said, as if a good divorce was the same thing as a good life. They'd sat in a lawyer's office and split the world into categories: custody, assets, schedules, holidays. They'd spoken politely. They'd both cried in private. Then they'd walked out into the parking lot and looked at each other like strangers who used to know how to touch. Avery hadn't hated her. He still didn't. What he hated was the way civilized could still feel like failure. He flipped a pancake, watched it land perfectly, and he thought, not for the first time, I couldn't keep the marriage, but I can keep the mornings. Down the hall, a small voice rose, sleepy and warm. Dad? In the kitchen, Pops. Footsteps, light, quick. Then Poppy appeared in the doorway with her hair like a storm cloud and her eyes half open. She wore mismatched socks because that was her signature form of rebellion. She blinked at him. "Is it pancake day?" Avery smiled. "It's always pancake day if you ask nicely." She grinned so wide it turned her whole face into sunrise. "Can I have the strawberry face?" Avery pointed at the cutting board. "Already working on it." Poppy climbed onto her stool like a tiny commander taking her post. She watched him slice strawberries into thin crescents. When she was younger, he used to worry she'd forget her mother if he did too much. Then he realized love didn't work like that. Love wasn't a pie you had to ration. Poppy didn't need less of him to make room for Sienna. She needed both. Avery plated the pancakes, arranged strawberries into eyes and a smile, then set the plate in front of her like an offering. Poppy gasped, "He's happy!" Avery poured syrup carefully. "That's because he knows he's about to be eaten." She giggled, then paused as if remembering something important. "Daddy? Ms. Klein says we're doing dream houses in art next week." Avery leaned against the counter. "Dream houses? Like, you draw the house you want when you grow up." He watched her chew thoughtfully, syrup on the corner of her mouth. "What do you want in yours?" Poppy didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted toward the living room where the couch sat like a tired animal, toward the hallway that led to her room, still decorated with stars he'd stuck on the ceiling when she was 3. "I want big windows," she finally said, very serious, "and a room that's just for drawing." Avery nodded slowly. "That sounds perfect." "And," she added, lowering her voice, "I want a door that doesn't stick." Avery blinked, caught off guard. Poppy's eyes widened like she hadn't meant to say it. Avery glanced at the front door across the living room, the stubborn one that sometimes jammed when the air got damp. He'd been meaning to fix it. He always meant to fix it. He reached out, wiped syrup from her chin. "We can do that." Poppy chewed faster, relieved the moment had passed. Avery looked at the door again. He had no idea that by the end of the day, that door would become the beginning of everything. Marlo Quinn's car smelled like old receipts and lavender hand sanitizer. She had been living in it, in a way. Not sleeping in it, but carrying her whole life in it like it was a shell she couldn't set down. When she drove into Harbor Pine, the fog made the town feel unreal, like a place that existed only when you believed in it. She slowed at the main street. A cafe with chalkboard menus, a bookstore with hand-painted signs, a hardware store that looked older than time. Should have felt peaceful. Instead, Marlo's shoulders stayed high. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel every time a truck passed, every time a man walked too close to her car at a stop sign, every time her phone buzzed, even though she'd changed her number 2 weeks ago. 7 years was a long time to live inside someone else's rules. You didn't walk out of that and instantly become free. You walked out and carried the echo of it everywhere, like a shadow that didn't match your body anymore. Marlo pulled into a quiet residential street and checked the address on a sticky note. Her friend Tessa had offered her a place to stay while she got on her feet. "I'm out of town for a month," Tessa had said. "Use my house, babe. Get settled. Start fresh." Fresh. Marlo had nodded, swallowed, and tried not to cry over the phone like it was a weakness. Now she parked on the side of the road, staring at a row of modest houses with small yards and mailboxes that leaned like sleepy heads. The sticky note read, 417 Alder Ridge. Tessa had texted her the directions. Blue house, white trim, lock sticks sometimes. Marlo looked up. There it was. Blue house, white trim, a front porch with 2 chairs and a small wind chime that moved in the breeze. She exhaled, feeling something in her ribs unclench for the first time in days. She grabbed her suitcase, her garment bag with her interview outfit, and the folder that held her resume like it was a passport. Then she walked up the steps. The key Tessa had given her was cold in her palm. She slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. Marlo frowned and tried again, wiggled it, pressed harder. The lock stuck, exactly like Tessa had said. Her stomach tightened. A lock that didn't open on the first try always made her pulse spike. It reminded her too much of doors she wasn't allowed to close. She took a breath, forced her hand steady, and tried again. The key turned. The door opened. Marlo stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not the dusty, unused smell of an empty house, but coffee and lemon cleaner and pancakes. She froze. Her mind snapped through possibilities the way it had learned to. Tessa came back early. Tessa forgot to tell me someone is staying. Someone broke in. I broke in. She took one step forward, then another, her suitcase rolling softly on the floor. The living room wasn't what she expected. It looked lived in. A child's backpack hung on a hook by the door. A small pair of shoes sat neatly under a bench. A drawing was taped to the wall, stick figures and a sun. Marlowe's heart started to pound. "Oh my God," she whispered. She turned toward this hallway, ready to leave, ready to apologize to an empty room and run back into the fog. And then a voice came from behind her, deep, calm, close. "Can I help you?" Marlowe spun. A man stood in the doorway to the kitchen. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants like he'd been living his morning in peace until she walked in and knocked it sideways. He was black, with warm brown skin and an expression that wasn't angry, but wasn't relaxed either. The kind of expression someone wore when they were bracing themselves to be misunderstood. In one hand he held a spatula, in the other a mug. Marlowe's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind him, a little girl perched on a stool, syrup on her lip, watching Marlowe like she was a strange animal that might bolt. The room went very still. Marlowe's throat tightened. I'm so sorry. I thought this was..." Her eyes darted to the hallway, to the door, to the keys in her hand. The man's gaze flickered to the key, then to her suitcase, then to the garment bag. He didn't move toward her. He didn't yell. But his body shifted in a way that told her he was assessing her as carefully as she was assessing him. "What are you doing in my house?" he asked, voice low. The word "my" landed hard. Marlowe felt her face drain of color. "This is going to sound insane," she whispered. "I'm supposed to be staying at my friend's house. She gave me the key. She said, 'Blue house, white trim, lock sticks.'" She held the key out like proof, like surrender. The man stared at it. The little girl's eyes went wide. Marlowe swallowed. I think she gave me the wrong address." Silence. The man's jaw tightened, then loosened. He looked at her again, not just at her clothes or her shaking hands, but at her face, like he was reading something beneath the mistake. Marlowe realized with a sick drop in her stomach that he could call the police. He should call the police. She had stepped into a stranger's home with a key that didn't belong to her. Her chest constricted. "I'm leaving," she said quickly, backing toward the door. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean..." The little girl slid off her stool. "Dad?" she said, uncertain. The man, Dad, held up a hand toward the child without looking away from Marlowe. "Poppy," he said softly. "Go sit. Please." Poppy hesitated, then obeyed, climbing back onto the stool but watching like her whole body was a question. Marlowe's fingers fumbled for the doorknob. The man's voice stopped her. "Wait." She froze. He exhaled, slow. "Do you have somewhere to go right now?" Marlowe blinked, confused. I'll find the right house. I'll call Tessa." He studied her garment bag. "You have an interview?" Marlowe's throat worked. "Yes, in 2 hours." The man's eyes softened just a fraction, like something in him recognized the kind of desperation that came with a fragile chance. "Sit down," he said. Marlowe stared at him. "What?" "I'm not asking you to stay," he clarified, carefully choosing words. "I'm asking you to sit down and breathe for a second before you go back out there looking like you've been chased." Marlowe's eyes stung. She shook her head. "You should call someone. You should..." "I know what I should do," he said quietly. Then after a beat he added, "But you look like you haven't slept, and you look scared. And if you mess up your interview because you're shaking, that's a cost I don't want on my conscience." Marlowe's lips parted. No one had spoken to her like that in years, not with anger, not with ownership, not with suspicion. With care. She swallowed hard. "I don't understand." The man's gaze flicked toward his daughter, then back. "My name is Avery Lane. That's Poppy, and this is definitely not your friend's house." Marlowe managed a small, broken laugh that sounded like it hurt. "I'm Marlowe Quinn. I'm really sorry." Avery nodded once. "Okay." He pointed toward the hallway. "Bathroom's down there. If you need to fix your hair, do it. Poppy and I will stay in here." Marlowe hesitated. Are you, are you serious? Avery's face didn't change, but his voice gentled. I'm serious. Poppy leaned forward. Dad, is she a robber? Marlo flinched. Avery turned to his daughter, voice firm but kind. No, baby, she made a mistake. Poppy squinted at Marlo. A big mistake. Marlo's cheeks burned. Yes, she whispered. A really big one. Poppy considered that, then said, Are you going to cry? Marlo blinked, startled. No, I don't think so. Poppy nodded like she'd accepted the answer. Okay. Avery set the mug down, then grabbed another. He poured coffee, the scent spreading through the room like warmth. Sit, he told Marlo again, softer. Just for a minute. Marlo's knees felt weak. She moved to the edge of the couch and sat like she was afraid it would accuse her. Avery placed the coffee on the coffee table in front of her. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough to offer. Sugar? He asked. Marlo shook her head. No, thank you. Avery nodded. Poppy, finish breakfast. Poppy's eyes remained fixed on Marlo. She looks like a ghost. Marlo let out a small sound, half laugh, half sob. I feel like one. Avery's gaze softened again, and this time Marlo saw it clearly. Fatigue. Not the tiredness of one bad night, but the kind that lived in your bones when you carried responsibility alone. He wasn't just being kind. He was choosing kindness in a world that didn't always reward it. Go, he said, nodding toward the hallway. Get ready. Marlo rose slowly, clutching her garment bag like armor. She walked to the bathroom, her shoes silent on the floor. At the door, she paused and looked back. Avery was watching her, not like a guard, but like someone making sure she didn't disappear. Marlo swallowed. Hello? Avery? Yeah. Thank you, she said, the words thick. You don't have to do this. Avery's jaw worked once. I know. Marlo stepped into the bathroom and closed the door. Inside, she gripped the sink, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were rimmed red. Her hair was slightly wild. Her face looked like a woman who'd spent years apologizing for existing. She turned on the faucet. The water ran, steady. Her hands shook. She pressed them to the cool porcelain, and she whispered so quietly the mirror almost couldn't hear. Don't ruin this. Not today. Outside, in the living room, Poppy whispered loudly to her dad. Dad, are you sure she's not a robber? Avery sighed. Pretty sure. Poppy leaned closer. What if she steals the TV? Avery's mouth twitched. Then we'll have to read books and talk to each other like it's 1890. Poppy gasped in horror. No, Avery chuckled under his breath, and for the first time that morning, the tightness in his chest loosened. He glanced toward the bathroom door. He didn't know Marlo Quinn, but he knew the look in her eyes. He'd seen it in his own reflection after his divorce, when he'd sat alone in this same kitchen, staring at a calendar full of shared custody days, wondering if the quiet was peace or punishment. He'd seen it in the faces of men at work who smiled too hard because they didn't want to be labeled angry. He'd seen it in his mother's eyes when she'd said, Baby, the world won't always give you grace, so you give it where you can. Avery exhaled. He turned off the stove. He poured more coffee. And he waited. Marlo came out of the bathroom 20 minutes later, dressed for war. She wore a navy blazer that fit her shoulders like it had been made for her, a white blouse that was crisp, and slacks that didn't wrinkle even when she moved like she might shatter. She looked calmer, but Avery could still see the tremor in her hands when she adjusted her cuff. He stood near the front door, keys in hand, giving her space. Your friend's address? He asked. Marlo fished her phone from her bag with shaky fingers. I have it. She scrolled, then frowned. It says 417 Alder Ridge. Avery blinked. That's this. Marlo's face went blank. What? Avery pointed toward the porch. That's my address. Marlo stared at her phone like it had betrayed her. No, she said blue house, white trim. Avery's brow furrowed. There's another blue house on Alder Ridge, 2 streets over, similar trim, and, he paused, they're lock sticks too. Marlo's mouth opened in disbelief, then closed. She made a sound like a laugh that didn't know if it was allowed. Avery's lips pressed together. So either your friend mixed up the address or someone mixed up the keys. Marlo looked down at the key in her hand. She handed me a ring of keys in a hurry. I didn't check. Avery nodded slowly. Okay, let's fix it. Marlo blinked. We? Avery opened the door. You can't show up to the wrong house again. That's how people get shot, Marlo. The bluntness of it made her inhale sharply. Avery's gaze held hers, steady, not threatening, just real. He continued, softer. I'll walk you over. Make sure you're safe and in the right place before your interview. Marlo stared at him as if he'd offered her something impossible. You don't have to, she began again, because she didn't know how to receive. Avery cut her off gently. I know. He looked back at Poppy. Pops, you good here for 5 minutes? Poppy put her hands on her hips like a tiny adult. I'm 8, Dad. Avery raised a brow. And? Poppy sighed dramatically. Fine, but if she steals the TV, I'm telling Mom. Avery chuckled. Fair. Marlo's lips twitched, surprised by laughter in a moment that should have been humiliation. They stepped outside into the fog. The air was damp and salty, the kind that clung to your skin like memory. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still waking. Avery walked beside Marlo, not too close, just present. 2 streets over, they found the other blue house, white trim, same wind chime, same sticky lock. Marlo's breath rushed out. Oh my God! Avery knocked. No answer. Marlo tried the key again. It didn't fit this lock. Her shoulders slumped. Avery frowned, then held out his hand. Let me see. Marlo hesitated, then handed him the ring. Avery examined the keys, found a similar one, and tried it. The lock stuck. He wiggled. The key turned. The door opened. Marlo stared at him. How did you? Avery shrugged. Experience. Marlo blinked. With breaking into houses? With stuck locks, he corrected dry. My front door does the same thing. The trick is to lift the handle slightly while you turn. Marlo shook her head, incredulous. This is the most ridiculous thing that's ever happened to me. Avery's gaze flicked to her face. I doubt that. Marlo's expression tightened, just a flash, a shadow behind her eyes. Then she forced a smile. Yeah, you're right. Avery didn't push. He stepped back as Marlo wheeled her suitcase inside. At the threshold, she paused and turned. Avery stood on the porch, fog curling around him like a cape. He looked like a man built to carry storms. Marlo's voice was quiet. Avery, thank you. Again. Avery nodded once, hands in his pockets. Go get that job. She hesitated. Can I pay you back? Coffee, something? Avery's mouth twitched. Just don't break into my house again. Marlo laughed, a real one this time. Deal. She closed the door gently. Avery stood there for a moment, listening to the click of the lock, this time the right lock. Then he walked back home. Poppy was waiting in the window, face pressed to the glass like a little spy. When Avery opened the door, Poppy asked immediately, Did she steal the TV? Avery sighed. No, Pops. Poppy narrowed her eyes. Did she steal your coffee? Avery paused, then smiled. No. Poppy's shoulders relaxed. Okay, then she can come back. Avery blinked. She can what? Poppy shrugged. She looked like she needed pancakes. Avery stared at his daughter, struck by how quickly children saw the truth. Then he looked at the empty doorway where Marlo had stood. And he felt, strangely, like he'd just opened a door inside himself he'd kept locked for years. Marlo got the job. She didn't find out immediately. She walked into the interview with her heart galloping, her voice steady only because she'd practiced steady for years. But when the phone call came 2 days later, when the hiring manager said, We'd love to bring you on, Marlo, she sat down on the floor of Tessa's blue house and cried until her ribs ached. Not because of the money, because of the meaning. A fresh start wasn't just a cute phrase, it was survival. She went to the Harbor Pine Cafe that afternoon because she needed to be around people without being touched by them. She needed noise, warmth, the smell of cinnamon and espresso, and because she'd promised herself she would thank Avery Lane properly. She spotted him immediately. He sat near the window, a laptop open, a cup of coffee in his hand. His posture was straight, but his shoulders looked tired. Across from him, a little girl colored in a notebook, tongue sticking out in concentration. Poppy. Marlo's chest tightened. She approached slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the moment. Avery looked up and froze. For a second, the cafe noise dimmed around them. Then Avery's eyes softened. "Marlo," he said, like her name belonged in his mouth now that it had context. "Hi," she breathed. I didn't know if you'd be here. Poppy looked up, startled, then her face lit with recognition. "The ghost lady!" Marlo blinked, then laughed. "That's me." Avery rubbed his forehead. "Poppy?" Poppy shrugged. "It's true, she looked like a ghost." Marlo sat carefully in the chair Avery gestured to. Avery's gaze studied her. "How'd it go?" Marlo's lips trembled. "I got it." Avery's smile appeared slowly, like sunrise breaking through fog. "Yeah?" Marlo nodded, eyes shining. "Yeah." Avery exhaled, relief crossing his face in a way that surprised her, as if her success mattered to him beyond the novelty of the story. He lifted his coffee cup in a small toast. "Told you." Marlo's laugh came out damp. "You did." Avery tilted his head. "So, you're staying in town?" Marlo nodded. "For now, I'll be working at Alder and Ash Interiors. It's small, but it's a start." Avery's brow lifted. "Interior design." Marlo's fingers traced the edge of her cup. "Yeah." Poppy leaned forward. "Do you make houses pretty?" Marlo smiled at her. "I try." Poppy's eyes widened. "Can you make my room look like a galaxy?" Avery gave his daughter a look. "Poppy." "What?" Poppy said, innocent. "It's a normal question." Marlo laughed softly. "A galaxy sounds amazing." Poppy beamed, then returned to her coloring, satisfied. Avery looked back at Marlo. "You okay?" Marlo hesitated. The easy answer was yes. The practiced answer was yes. But Avery's eyes were steady, like he wasn't asking to fill silence. He was asking because he wanted to know. Marlo swallowed. "I'm better," she said carefully. "I left something complicated. I moved here to start over." Avery nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said. He didn't pry. Instead, he asked, "Do you have people here?" Marlo's chest tightened again. "Just Tessa, for now." Avery's gaze held hers. "Then, welcome." The word wasn't dramatic. It wasn't romantic. It was simple. And somehow, that made it feel like the most generous thing she'd heard in years. They talked for 20 minutes, then 40, about the town, about the ocean, about how the fog made everything look like it was underwater. Poppy chimed in occasionally with observations that made Marlo laugh in a way that startled her own body. Avery watched those laughs like they were something fragile and valuable. When Marlo finally stood to leave, she hesitated, then said, "I owe you." Avery shook his head. "No, you don't." Marlo's voice softened. "You didn't have to be kind." Avery's expression turned distant for a moment, as if he was looking at an old version of himself. Then he said quietly, "Yeah, I did." Marlo blinked. Avery added, almost too soft to hear, "The world doesn't always give people like us the benefit of the doubt." Marlo's throat tightened because she understood exactly what he meant, how fear could shape the way people saw you, how one mistake could become a sentence. Avery stood, picked up Poppy's backpack, and slung it over his shoulder. "I'm glad you got the job," he said, then nodded at her. "See you around, Marlo Quinn." Marlo watched them leave. Avery's hand rested lightly on Poppy's shoulder as they walked. Poppy chattered. Avery listened. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a life. And Marlo realized, with a strange ache, that she wanted to be near that kind of steadiness, not to be saved by it, just to remember what safety felt like. A relationship didn't start with a kiss, not for them. It started with small, ordinary moments that didn't ask for permission to matter. It started with Marlo showing up at the cafe again by coincidence, only to find Avery there, tapping at his laptop, as if the town had decided to keep placing them in each other's orbit. It started with Avery noticing that Marlo always sat where she could see the door. It started with Marlo noticing that Avery always waited an extra second before speaking to strangers, as if weighing how he would be received. It started with shared smiles over Poppy's dramatic opinions. It started with coffee, always coffee. Avery worked as a project manager for a construction company that did coastal renovations. His job had him balancing budgets and deadlines, making sure people didn't cut corners that would later collapse. Marlowe joked once that he sounded like he was keeping the world from falling apart. Avery had answered, "Just my corner of it." Marlowe worked at Alder and Ash, learning the names of clients who wanted cozy coastal and modern rustic like they were commandments. She stayed late often, not because she had to, but because she didn't like going home to quiet yet. Quiet still felt like waiting for something bad. One rainy evening, her office building's power flickered out. The streetlights glowed dim. The wind rattled branches. Marlowe stood outside, hugging her coat tight, searching her purse for her keys with hands that suddenly wouldn't stop shaking. A voice behind her said, "You okay?" She turned and saw Avery in his truck, window down, rain beating on the roof. He looked at her the way he always did, steady, present, not demanding. Marlowe tried to smile. "Yeah, just dumb weather." "Dumb?" Avery's gaze flicked to her hands. "You need a ride?" Marlowe hesitated, reflexes flaring. Don't get in a man's car. Don't owe anyone anything. But Avery wasn't a man. Avery was the person who'd let her breathe in his living room instead of calling the police. Still, fear didn't care about logic. Avery saw the hesitation and leaned back. "No pressure, just asking." Marlowe swallowed. "My place is close." Avery nodded. "Okay." Then he did something that changed everything without looking like it. He didn't drive away. He put the truck in park. He waited. So she wasn't alone in the dark. Marlowe's throat tightened. After a minute, she found her keys, exhaled shakily, and looked at him again. "You don't have to wait," she said. Avery shrugged. "I'm already here." Marlowe nodded, then walked to her car. When she glanced back, Avery was still there. Rain, fog, headlights like soft moons. He stayed until her taillights disappeared down the street. Later that night, Marlowe sat on her couch and realized she was crying. Not from fear, from relief. The first time Marlowe heard Sienna's name out loud, it wasn't in a bitter tone. It was in a sentence that sounded like a schedule. Avery glanced at his phone in the cafe and said, "I've got to pick up Poppy. Sienna's dropping her at 5. Marlowe blinked. "Sienna is my ex-wife," Avery said simply. Marlowe's stomach tightened, not jealousy, something older, something that remembered how her ex had used other women's names like weapons. Avery noticed the shift in her face. "It's good between us," he said, careful. "As good as it can be." Marlowe nodded slowly. "That's rare." Avery's smile was small, tired. "We worked hard at it, for Poppy." Marlowe's chest ached. "You're a good dad." Avery's gaze lowered. "I try." A week later, Marlowe saw Sienna for the first time by accident. It was at a park near the water, where Poppy liked to feed seagulls even though Avery insisted she shouldn't. Marlowe had been walking home, hands in her pockets, when she spotted them. Avery standing near the bench, Poppy bouncing like a spring, and a woman with curly hair and a coat the color of sand. Sienna. Marlowe stopped short, heart thudding. Sienna laughed at something Poppy said, then turned to Avery with a look that was familiar. Fond, yes, but also distant, like looking at a photograph you didn't want to tear up. Avery smiled politely. They weren't enemies. They were two adults sharing the same sacred thing. Poppy ran toward the swings, leaving Avery and Sienna alone for a moment. Sienna touched Avery's arm briefly, saying something too quiet to hear. Avery nodded. Then, as if sensing Marlowe's gaze, Avery looked up. He saw her. Marlowe's breath caught. Avery hesitated, then lifted a hand in a small wave. Marlowe forced herself to move, walking closer like she wasn't suddenly aware of every inch of her body. Avery met her halfway, leaving Sienna near the bench. "Marlowe," he said softly. "Hey." Marlowe tried to smile. "Hi." Avery's eyes searched hers. "You okay?" Marlowe nodded, even though she wasn't sure. "Yeah." He glanced back toward Sienna. "This is Sienna." Sienna looked up and her eyes met Marlowe's with calm curiosity. She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She simply stood and walked over. "Hi," Sienna said, extending a hand. "You must be Marlowe." Marlowe blinked, startled. Yes, hi." They shook hands. Sienna's grip was warm, confident. She smiled politely. "Avery told me about the wrong house incident," Marlowe's face flushed. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. It was humiliating. Sienna laughed softly, not cruelly. It sounds like something that would happen in this town. Locks sticking, addresses repeating themselves, Harbor Pine likes its quirks. Marlowe relaxed a fraction. Sienna glanced at Avery, and for a moment her eyes softened. I'm glad you were kind, she said to him. Avery's jaw tightened slightly. Yeah. Sienna turned back to Marlowe. And I'm glad you're okay. The words were simple, but Marlowe felt them land like grace. Thank you, Marlowe whispered. Sienna nodded, then looked toward Poppy on the swings. You'll have to excuse me. The gulls are winning the battle for her fries. She walked away. Avery exhaled, shoulders dropping. Marlowe stared after Sienna. She's nice. Avery's mouth twitched. She is. Marlowe glanced at him. Does that make it harder? Avery's gaze stayed on his daughter. Sometimes. Marlowe's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Avery turned to her, and his eyes held a truth that wasn't dramatic, just heavy. Don't be, he said quietly. It ended for reasons. But, yeah, it still leaves marks. Marlowe nodded slowly. Marks. She understood that language. They stood there in the salt wind, watching Poppy swing higher, her laughter rising above the waves. And Marlowe realized she didn't want to be a storm in their lives. She wanted to be something steady. But she didn't know if she deserved that. Not yet. Avery didn't rush. He liked Marlowe, more than liked, if he was honest. Her quiet strength pulled at him. Her laughter warmed the corners of him he'd kept cold. But he had a child. Poppy wasn't just a part of his life. She was the center. Avery had promised himself after the divorce that he wouldn't bring someone into Poppy's world unless it was real. Unless it was safe. So he waited. He watched Marlowe. The way she flinched at sudden loud voices, the way she apologized too quickly, the way she sometimes stared out at the ocean like she was still learning how to exist without permission. And he watched the way she softened around Poppy, even from a distance, smiling when Poppy waved at her in the cafe, laughing when Poppy declared, Your hair looks like a fancy bird. One evening, after Marlowe helped Avery pick out paint samples for a small renovation project, just as friends, he told himself, Avery walked her to her car. The fog was thick. Streetlights glowed like lanterns. Marlowe hugged her coat around herself. Thanks for today. Avery nodded. You're good at what you do. Marlowe's smile was tired. I'm trying to be. Avery hesitated, then said, Poppy's been asking about you. Marlowe froze. What? Avery watched her carefully. She thinks you're interesting. Marlowe's voice went small. Kids don't usually think I'm interesting. Avery's brow furrowed. Why? Marlowe looked away. Because I spent a long time trying to be invisible. Avery's throat tightened. He waited, letting the silence hold what she couldn't say. Then he asked, Would you want to meet her properly, not just at the cafe? Marlowe's heart kicked. Fear rose first. Fear of messing up, fear of being judged, fear of becoming attached. But beneath the fear was something else, longing. Marlowe swallowed. I don't know if I'm good at that. Avery's voice was gentle. You don't have to be anything except yourself. Marlowe's eyes stung. What if myself is damaged? Avery didn't look away. Then we go slow. Marlowe searched his face like she was looking for the trick. There was none. She nodded once, very small. Okay. Avery exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. Okay. They chose a Saturday afternoon, neutral ground, the park near the water, Poppy's favorite place. Avery arrived first with Poppy, a sketchbook under his arm and a bag of snacks because parenting meant always being prepared for hunger-based drama. Poppy ran ahead, boots splashing in puddles. Avery watched her, heart full and afraid. When Marlowe arrived, she moved slowly, like she wasn't sure she belonged in the frame yet. She carried a tote bag. Avery noticed her knuckles were white around the strap. Marlowe, he said, stepping forward. Marlowe smiled, but her eyes flicked to Poppy like she was approaching a wild animal. Poppy turned and stared. She didn't run toward Marlowe the way she ran toward Avery. She stood still, studying. Avery crouched beside his daughter. Pops, this is Marlowe. Poppy's eyes narrowed. The ghost lady. Marlowe laughed softly. Yep. Poppy tilted her head. Are you going to break into our house again? Marlo blinked, then shook her head quickly. No, never again. Poppy considered that. Good. Marlo crouched a little too, trying to meet Poppy's height. I brought something. Poppy's gaze flicked to the tote bag. Is it candy? Avery sighed. Poppy, Marlo smiled. Not candy. Poppy's face fell. Then I don't care. Marlo reached into the bag and pulled out colored pencils and a set of thick sketch markers. Poppy's eyes widened. Marlo held them out like an offering. I heard you like drawing. Poppy stared, then glanced at Avery. Avery nodded slightly. It's okay. Poppy reached out slowly and took the markers like they might vanish. These are the good kind. Marlo's smile grew. I know. Poppy's gaze lifted to Marlo's face again. Can you draw? Marlo shrugged. A little. Poppy narrowed her eyes again, challenging. Draw me a cat. Marlo laughed, then pulled out a sketch pad from her tote. She knelt on the grass, uncapped a marker, and drew quickly. A cat appeared, simple but charming, with big eyes and whiskers like fireworks. Poppy gasped. He's cute. Marlo added a tiny crown on the cat's head. He's a king. Poppy giggled, a bright, sudden sound that made Avery's chest ache. Poppy grabbed the marker. I'm going to draw his house. Marlo leaned closer. What kind of house does a cat king live in? Poppy thought hard. A castle, with big windows. Avery blinked, startled. That was what she'd said earlier. Marlo smiled softly. Big windows are the best. They let light in. Poppy began drawing furiously. Marlo sat beside her, not touching, just present. Avery watched them like he was watching a miracle happen in slow motion. Poppy didn't suddenly call Marlo family. She didn't hug her, but she let her sit close. She let her see the inside of her imagination. And that was a door Avery knew better than most adults. Once Poppy opened it, she didn't do it halfway. The dream house lesson. Over the next weeks, Marlo and Poppy built a quiet ritual. Sometimes it was in the cafe with crayons on napkins. Sometimes it was at Avery's house, carefully timed, always with Avery present, always with consent. Marlo never tried to parent. She didn't tell Poppy what to do. She didn't correct her. She didn't claim space she hadn't earned. She simply offered tools and listened. One afternoon, Poppy sat at Avery's kitchen table drawing again, her brow furrowed in concentration. Marlo sat across from her, marker in hand, sketching alongside. Avery washed dishes, pretending not to watch, even though he watched everything. Poppy suddenly said, "Why do you live here?" Marlo froze, marker hovering. Avery's hand stilled in the sink. Marlo cleared her throat gently. "In Harbor Pine?" Poppy nodded. Marlo swallowed. Children asked questions like they were pulling thread. They didn't know what might unravel. "I needed a fresh start," Marlo said carefully. Poppy's eyes were serious. "Did something bad happen?" Avery's heart tightened. Marlo looked at Avery for a fraction of a second, as if asking permission. Avery's gaze was steady, supportive. Marlo turned back to Poppy. "Yes," she admitted softly. "Something bad happened, but I left. And I'm okay now." Poppy studied her. "Did someone hurt you?" Marlo's throat tightened. She didn't want to lie. She didn't want to spill. She chose the truth that a child could hold without being broken by it. "Someone tried to control me," Marlo said quietly. "They tried to make me small." Poppy frowned, offended on Marlo's behalf. "That's rude." Marlo let out a surprised laugh. "It is rude." Poppy nodded firmly. "You're not small." Marlo's eyes stung. "No," she whispered. "I'm not." Avery turned away from the sink so they wouldn't see the way his face shifted. The ache, the admiration, the anger at a world that had taught Marlo to doubt her own size. Poppy leaned forward. "Do you feel safe now?" Marlo swallowed, then nodded. "I'm learning." Poppy considered that. Then she said very quietly, "My dad feels safe when the house is clean." Avery blinked. Poppy didn't look at him. She kept drawing, as if she hadn't just named him in a way that felt too accurate. Marlo's gaze lifted to Avery, soft. Avery's throat worked. He said nothing. Poppy continued. "When Mom left, Dad cleaned a lot." Avery's hands clenched at his sides. Marlo's voice was gentle. That makes sense. Poppy added, I think he was trying to make the world not messy. Marlo nodded slowly. Sometimes we do that. Poppy drew a big square on the page. This is my dream house. It has big windows. Marlo leaned in. What else? Poppy drew 3 stick figures. Avery's breath caught. Poppy wrote names above them in messy letters. Dad, Poppy, Marlo. Then she wrote, underneath slowly, tongue between her teeth, my family. The room went silent. The marker in Marlo's hand stopped moving. Avery felt something crack open in his chest. Poppy looked up, suddenly shy, as if realizing she'd revealed something too big. Marlo stared at the paper like it was a sacred thing. Avery's voice came out rough. Poppy. Poppy's cheeks flushed. What? It's just a drawing. Marlo's eyes shimmered. She forced a smile that trembled. It's a beautiful drawing. Poppy shrugged like she didn't care, but her shoulders were tight. It's not finished. Marlo nodded, voice soft. We don't have to finish it today. Avery turned away, pretending to check the mail on the counter. Because if he looked at them right then, he might cry. And Avery Lane had promised himself he wouldn't cry in front of his daughter unless it was something worth teaching her. This might be worth it. A year passed. Not with fireworks. With routines. With coffee refills and grocery runs and Poppy's school projects. With Marlo painting samples and Avery fixing the sticky lock on the front door, finally, because Marlo teased him that fate didn't need that kind of invitation anymore. With Sienna continuing to co-parent like a woman determined not to let her child become collateral damage. With Marlo slowly, quietly, becoming woven into the fabric of Avery's life. Sometimes she startled herself by how natural it felt. Sometimes she woke at night, panic in her throat, expecting a text from her ex, a demand, a threat, but then she would hear the house, safe sounds, and remember where she was. One evening, Marlo stayed late at Alder and Ash finishing a proposal. Her boss, Nina, leaned on the doorway, smiling. You've got talent, Quinn. Marlo looked up, tired. Thanks. Nina hesitated. I got a call today. Marlo's stomach tightened. About what? Nina smiled wider. About you. Marlo blinked. Nina said, a firm in Seattle, high-end, big projects. They're looking for a lead designer. Someone recommended you. Marlo's heart lurched. Seattle? Nina nodded. They want to talk. The salary is ridiculous. Marlo's breath caught. Her mind flashed images. Sleek offices, big paychecks, a life where she'd never have to count grocery money again. A life where she'd never be trapped because she couldn't afford to leave. Freedom. Nina watched her carefully. You should do it. Marlo swallowed. I have a life here. Nina nodded, understanding. Then you decide what matters more. That night, Marlo drove home with the offer sitting in her passenger seat like a second person. She didn't tell Avery immediately. Not because she wanted to hide it, because she was terrified of what his eyes would do when she did. 2 days later, Marlo sat with Avery on his porch. The fog was light tonight, the ocean audible in the distance like a deep breath. Poppy was inside, drawing, humming to herself. Avery handed Marlo a mug of coffee. Marlo stared at it like it was an anchor. Avery, she said quietly. Avery looked at her, instantly alert. What's wrong? Marlo exhaled. I got an offer. Avery's brow furrowed. From where? Seattle. The word hung between them. Avery didn't speak for a moment. Marlo's voice rushed as if she could outrun the pain. It's lead designer. The salary is... it's life-changing. Avery nodded slowly, jaw tight. Okay. Marlo blinked. Okay? Avery's gaze stayed on hers. You earned it. Marlo's throat tightened. It means moving. Avery's eyes didn't flinch, but something in him went still, like a door quietly closing. I figured, he said softly. Marlo's chest ached. I don't want to hurt you. Avery's mouth twitched, but it wasn't a smile. Then don't. Marlo swallowed hard. It's not that simple. Avery looked away toward the street, the fog, the dim porch light. His voice came out careful. What do you want me to say, Marlo? Marlo's eyes burned. I want you to tell me you want me to stay. Avery turned back, and the pain in his eyes hit her like wind. I do, he admitted, voice rough. I want you to stay. Marlowe inhaled sharply. Avery continued, forcing honesty out like it hurt. But I'm not going to be the reason you turn down something that big. Marlowe's voice broke. You're not the reason? You're my life. Avery swallowed hard. And Poppy? Marlowe's breath caught. Avery's voice softened. She's attached, Marlowe. She's Poppy. She opens her heart and doesn't know how to close it halfway. Marlowe's tears spilled. I know. Avery's eyes were shiny too, but he didn't let them fall. He had learned long ago how to hold tears like held breath. I've already failed once, he whispered, almost to himself. Marlowe froze. Avery. Avery shook his head, voice bitter for the first time. Not you, not this, just... I promised myself I wouldn't let Poppy watch someone leave again. Marlowe's chest cracked open. She whispered, I'm not leaving because I don't love you. Avery's voice was quiet. Then why are you leaving? Marlowe couldn't answer without unraveling everything she'd been running from, because money meant safety, because she'd been trapped once, because she feared needing anyone, because she feared losing them, because freedom was the first love she'd ever had. She stared down at her coffee, hands shaking. Avery watched her, and something in him softened. He reached out, slowly, and placed his hand over hers, not gripping, just warmth. I'm not him, he said quietly, like he knew exactly where her mind had gone. Marlowe's sob escaped. Avery's voice stayed steady. I'm not going to control you, Marlowe. I'm not going to guilt you. I'm not going to punish you for choosing your future. Marlowe looked up, tears on her cheeks. But what if my future is here? Avery's eyes held hers, aching. Then stay. Marlowe's chest rose and fell too fast. Inside the house, Poppy's humming drifted through the open window. Marlowe realized she was shaking the way she'd shaken in Avery's living room that first morning. But this time, the fear wasn't of being caught. It was of choosing. Avery squeezed her hand gently. Whatever you decide, we'll be okay. Marlowe whispered, Will we? Avery's voice softened. We have to be. The next day, Marlowe came over to help Poppy with an art project. Avery was at work. Sienna was picking Poppy up later. Marlowe sat at the kitchen table with Poppy, guiding her through a collage. Poppy chatted about school, about seagulls, about how her teacher said her handwriting was creative. Marlowe laughed, but her mind was elsewhere. Seattle sat in her chest like a ticking clock. Poppy looked up suddenly. Are you going to go away? Marlowe froze. Her voice caught. Why would you ask that? Poppy shrugged too casually. I heard Dad talking on the phone last night. Marlowe's throat tightened. What did you hear? Poppy frowned. He sounded sad. Marlowe's heart clenched. Poppy reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded paper. I made something, she said quietly. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat on the table. Marlowe's breath stopped. It was a drawing. 3 figures under a big, square house with huge windows. A sun in the corner. A tree that looked like a green explosion, and underneath, in careful letters that looked practiced, my family. Marlowe's eyes filled instantly. Poppy's voice was small. I don't want you to go. Marlowe swallowed hard. Poppy. Poppy's eyes were fierce, like she was trying to be brave. But if you have to, you can. Marlowe's chest shattered at the maturity in that sentence. Poppy added, Dad will clean a lot, like when Mom left. Marlowe covered her mouth, a sob escaping. Poppy frowned, worried. Are you crying? Marlowe laughed through tears. Yes, I'm sorry. Poppy reached across the table and put her small hand on Marlowe's wrist. It was a simple touch, but it felt like being chosen. Poppy whispered, You feel safe here, right? Marlowe's breath trembled. Yes. Poppy nodded slowly. Then stay. Marlowe stared at the drawing, at the big windows, at the word family written like it was truth. And she realized something that made her shake. Seattle wasn't just a job. It was an old fear wearing a new suit. It was the part of her that believed she could only be safe if she was untouchable. But the safety she wanted now wasn't distance, it was belonging. Marlo looked at Poppy, voice trembling. "If I stay, I need you to know something." Poppy blinked. "What?" Marlo whispered. "I'm not perfect." Poppy stared. "Nobody is." Marlo nodded, tears falling. "Sometimes I get scared for no reason. Sometimes I think people will leave. Sometimes I don't know how to trust." Poppy considered that, then said, "You can learn." Marlo's chest ached. "Yes," Poppy smiled softly. "I'll teach you." Marlo laughed, broken open. She pulled Poppy into a gentle hug, slow, careful, giving Poppy the option to pull away. Poppy hugged back without hesitation. Marlo closed her eyes. And inside that small, warm moment, the decision settled like a stone finding the bottom of a river. That night, Marlo called Nina. Nina answered with a cheerful, "Tell me you're taking it." Marlo's voice shook. "I'm not." A pause. Then Nina said softly, "Okay." Marlo exhaled, surprised by the lack of judgment. Nina added, "You sure?" Marlo stared out the window at the foggy street, at the porch light glowing at Avery's house across the way. "I'm sure," she whispered. "For the first time in a long time, I'm choosing something that isn't fear." Nina's voice softened. "Then I'm proud of you." Marlo's eyes filled again. "Thank you." When she hung up, Marlo sat very still. She expected panic. Instead, she felt quiet. Not empty quiet. Peace quiet. Avery found out the next morning. Marlo showed up at his job site with coffee, 2 cups, the way she'd learned he liked it. Avery stepped out of the half-renovated house and wiped his hands on his jeans, surprised. "Marlo?" he asked. "What are you doing here?" Marlo held out the coffee. "Bribing you into listening." Avery took it, eyes searching hers. "Okay." Marlo inhaled, steadying herself. "I turned it down," she said. Avery froze. "Seattle?" Marlo nodded. "Yes." Avery stared at her like he didn't trust what he was hearing. "Why?" Marlo swallowed hard. "Because I don't want to run anymore." Avery's throat worked. "Marlo," she cut him off gently, voice trembling. "Don't you dare feel guilty." Avery blinked. Marlo stepped closer, eyes shining. "I'm not staying because you asked. I'm staying because I looked at my life and for the first time it looked like something I didn't want to escape." Avery's eyes filled. He looked away quickly, jaw clenched, and Marlo realized he was fighting tears the way some men fought wars. Marlo reached for his hand. Avery let her. His grip was warm, strong, a little shaky. He whispered, "Are you sure?" Marlo nodded. "I'm sure." Avery closed his eyes for a second, breathing like he'd been underwater and just reached air. Then he opened them and looked at her with something that made Marlo's chest ache. "Thank you," he whispered. Marlo shook her head. "No, thank you." Avery swallowed. I don't know how to do this without breaking something." Marlo's voice softened. "Then we go slow." Avery's mouth twitched at the echo of his own words from months ago. He nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Yeah." Marlo leaned in, careful, and kissed him. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't desperate. It was a promise spoken without words. Avery's hand tightened around hers like he was anchoring himself to the present. When they pulled back, Marlo laughed softly, embarrassed. Avery's smile grew. "What?" Marlo wiped a tear. "I can't believe a wrong key did all this." Avery looked at her, eyes warm. Maybe it wasn't wrong. Marlo exhaled, and in the distance the ocean kept breathing like it approved. Time moved the way it always did, not in dramatic leaps, in quiet layers. Poppy grew taller. Her handwriting got less creative. Her art got better, sharper, full of color and story. Marlo became lead designer at Alder and Ash anyway because talent found its place when you stopped running. Avery fixed the sticky lock, then replaced the door entirely, joking that fate didn't need shortcuts anymore. Sienna remained in Poppy's life like a steady star, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always present. And Avery and Marlo built something that wasn't perfect, but was real. They argued sometimes, about schedules, about money, about how Marlo hated loud voices and Avery hated silence when conflict was unresolved. But they learned, They listened. They apologized. They didn't use love as a weapon. Then, on a rainy evening that smelled like beginnings, Avery asked Marlo to come upstairs. "What's this?" Marlo asked, suspicious, as he guided her down the hallway. Avery's face was unreadable, but his hand was warm around hers. "Just come." Poppy peeked out of her room, eyes bright. "It's happening." Marlo blinked. "What's happening?" Poppy grinned and ducked back inside like she'd said too much. Avery opened the bathroom door. Marlo stepped in. The light was soft, golden. Candles lined the sink. The mirror was fogged slightly, like the room remembered its history. Marlo's chest tightened. Avery closed the door behind them. He stood in front of her, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't seen since the day they met. Marlo whispered, "Avery?" Avery swallowed, then pulled a small box from his pocket. Marlo's breath hitched. Avery's voice came out rough. You told me once you didn't understand why I was kind." Marlo stared at him. Avery continued, eyes shiny. "I didn't understand it either, not fully. I just saw you, and I knew that if I turned you into a criminal in my head, it would be because the world has taught me to see people that way." Marlo's eyes filled. Avery's hand trembled slightly as he opened the box. "This is where we started," he said quietly. "Not with romance, not with promises, with a choice." Marlo whispered, "You chose me." Avery shook his head. "I chose kindness." Marlo's tears spilled. Avery's voice softened, breaking. "And then you chose us." A soft sound from outside the door, Poppy shifting, unable to contain herself. Avery smiled without looking away from Marlo. He dropped to one knee. Marlo's breath stopped. Avery looked up at her, eyes steady, the same steadiness that had held her up on her worst days. "Marlo Quinn," he said, voice low. "Will you marry me?" Marlo covered her mouth. For a second, fear tried to rise. Fear of commitment, fear of being trapped, fear of losing herself. But then she remembered. This wasn't a cage. This was a home. She nodded hard, tears falling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. Avery? Yes." Avery's shoulders sagged in relief and he laughed, quiet, disbelieving. He stood and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit, like it had been waiting. Outside the door, Poppy squealed. "Yes!" Marlo laughed through tears. "Poppy!" The door flew open. Poppy launched herself at Marlo, hugging her waist. Marlo wrapped her arms around the child, trembling. Poppy looked up, eyes shining, and said, soft, almost shy, "Mom?" Marlo's heart shattered open. She looked at Avery, pleading silently, "Is this okay?" Avery nodded, eyes wet. Marlo knelt and cupped Poppy's face gently. "Yes, baby," she whispered, "if you want me to be." Poppy nodded fiercely. "I do." Marlo hugged her tight. Avery wrapped his arms around both of them. And in that small bathroom, where fear had once waited behind a stuck lock, something healed. Not perfectly, but truly. They married in the backyard. String lights hung between trees like tiny stars. The grass was damp from morning fog. The ocean wind carried laughter and the smell of food from neighbors who treated the wedding like a town holiday. Marlo wore a simple dress, elegant in its lack of armor. Avery wore a dark suit that made him look like a man who belonged in every room he entered. Poppy wore a flower crown and took her job as assistant of honor very seriously. Sienna arrived quietly, dressed in a soft blue coat, her hair curled, her expression calm. Marlo's stomach tightened when she saw her, old fears flickering. But Sienna walked up with a small smile and held out a gift bag. "For you," Sienna said. Marlo blinked. "Sienna, you didn't have to—" Sienna shook her head gently. "Yes, I did." Marlo swallowed. "Thank you." Sienna's gaze softened. "Poppy loves you." Marlo's throat tightened. "I love her too." Sienna nodded slowly, then added almost too quietly, "And I'm grateful." Marlo's eyes filled. "For what?" Sienna looked toward Avery, who was talking to a guest, his posture straight, but his hands fidgeting, nervous. "For giving them peace," Sienna said simply. Marlo's chest ached. "I'm trying." Sienna smiled softly. "That's all anyone can do." When the ceremony began, the officiant spoke about fate and choice. But the real ceremony was in the small things, Avery's hand shaking slightly as he took Marlowe's. Marlowe's breath hitching as she looked at Poppy in the front row, grinning so wide it made her cheeks hurt. The wind chime on this porch ringing, as if the house itself was applauding. When it was time for vows, Avery's voice was steady but thick. "I don't promise perfection," he said, eyes locked on Marlowe. "I promise presence. I promise honesty. I promise I will never make you smaller to make myself feel bigger." Marlowe's tears spilled. When it was her turn, Marlowe's voice trembled dead. "I promise I will not run when love feels scary," she said. "I promise I will let safety be something I share, not something I hide behind. I promise. I choose you every day." Avery's eyes shone. They exchanged rings. Poppy sniffled dramatically and whispered loudly, "This is so romantic." Guests laughed softly. Avery kissed Marlowe, slow, tender, real. Applause rose like waves. Later, as the sun dipped, Poppy dragged Marlowe toward the house. "I have something," she said, urgent. Marlowe laughed. "What is it?" Poppy pulled a framed picture from her room and handed it to Marlowe with both hands. It was the drawing, the dream house, big windows, 3 stick figures, my family. Marlowe's breath caught. "Poppy." Poppy's face was serious. "You can hang it in the living room now." Marlowe knelt, eyes wet. "Yes, baby." Avery walked up behind them and crouched too. He rested a hand on Poppy's shoulder. "You did good, Pops." Poppy sniffed. "I know." Marlowe laughed through tears and leaned into Avery. The 3 of them pressed together like pieces that finally fit. The string lights flickered above them. The ocean kept breathing. The house held their laughter like it had been built for it. And somewhere, deep in the quiet, the wrong key turned into the right one. Not because fate was magic, but because kindness is. Years later, Marlowe would still think about that morning. The fog, the stuck lock, the shock of seeing Avery in the kitchen with a spatula in his hand. She would remember the fear in her own body. And she would remember something else, even stronger. The way Avery chose not to make her mistake her whole identity. The way he offered coffee instead of punishment. The way that one small, ordinary act became the seed of a home. Because sometimes, life doesn't change in one grand moment. Sometimes it changes in a single choice. To be kind when it's easier to be cruel. To stay when it's safer to run. To call someone family when you've only ever called yourself alone. And if this story touches a corner of your memory, if you've ever walked through the wrong door or feared you didn't deserve a safe place, maybe this is your reminder. A mistake can still lead you home. If you meet it with kindness, if you choose it with courage, if you let yourself belong.